Uh, Good morning, everybody. I am trying to get to where we can see over here. I'll just pull out my Bible. We're going to be talking about the American government and submission to the government, and specifically about the American Revolution. Somebody asked a question, what about the American Revolution? Would it have been bad? Would it have been wrong to be part of the American Revolution? Now, I'll tell you at the outset that the point of being a Christian is not to justify your country or anything that has happened in the past. The point is to serve God today. So to some extent, it doesn't really matter what happened years ago in the American Revolution. What matters is that we serve God in the United States today, or whatever country you happen to live in. So according to what the Bible says, should we support the American Revolution if we were alive back in the 1700s? Well, Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. So that's kind of our overriding principle. So there is some type of submission, some type of obedience that you owe to your government. And we should always be giving that to the government, not looking for ways that we can get around rules, not looking for ways that we can disobey, not looking for ways that we can outsmart the governing authorities. When there's a law, Christians should be the first to obey that law. We should desire to follow the rules. So go back to the American Revolution. What about the American Revolution? Clearly, you have people who are rebelling against another government. Would it be possible to be part of that rebellion and still be pleasing to God? Thankfully, the answer is God will ultimately decide. But if it were happening today, like let's say that something terrible happened and England came over and took over the United States again, would it be right? Would it be okay? Then years after Great Britain is now in charge of us again, could we rebel? Probably not. Probably not. And the reason why is, open up your Bibles, if you got them, to Romans chapter 13. We're going to look at just a couple different places. We're going to Romans chapter 13, Titus chapter 3, and 1 Peter chapter 2. So look in Romans chapter 13. And this is what it says. Right? So we're going to take this principle and we're going to try and apply it back to what happened in the 18th century, and then look at what we would do today. It says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, I've heard people try and say, well, God is just appointing the idea of government and not specific governments. Well, that's cool, except that God says he raises up and tears down kingdoms, and that he uses the political machinations of the world in order to bring about his goals. So while I'm not going to say necessarily that God raises up and tears down every single government, there are certainly ones where he is raising up and tearing down. Well, that brings the question, was he tearing down the British government here and raising up the American government? Maybe. I would certainly look at all the good that has happened from the United States and argue that that's probably what was going on. But it's not my job to pierce the veil, so to speak. It's my job to be obedient to the government as they exist. So as a Christian, personally, I would feel obliged to be subject to the governing authorities. So when the royal government put governors over, when there's a royal governor of Massachusetts, a royal governor of New York, I would feel compelled to be subject to the royal governor. I would feel compelled to be subject to Parliament in the 18th century. And so that's kind of where I would be sitting. Well, what about other places? Is there another place where we could look and say, oh, well, this gives us the right to rebel? Let's look. Let's go over to Titus chapter 3. So, Titus chapter 3. Oh, I forgot. My kids ripped Titus out of this Bible. Yeah, I got to get a different Bible. Hang on. Titus isn't in my Bible. It's in this one. Yeah, somebody ripped it out. I don't know who did it. They won't fess up. Okay, so Titus chapter 3 says, remind them to be subject to the rulers, to authorities, to be obedient for every good deed, to malign no one, to be peaceable, showing every consideration for all men. So to be subject to rulers. Now, don't forget that Romans chapter 13 is written to people who are in Rome, the Romans, and they are to be subject to the Caesar, who at the time it's written could be Nero. Right? Depending on when you think that letter is written, it could be Nero. So you're being a Christian being told to be subject to somebody who makes crazy decisions. Here you have reminded to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient and ready for every good deed. It doesn't say be subject to the rulers if they're nice. Be subject to the rulers if they're good people. It doesn't even say be subject to the rulers if they follow the laws themselves. And so this is kind of a big deal. It's not a follow the rulers, listen to the rulers when you feel like it. Follow the rules when they seem to be good. We're to follow the rules all the time, always. And that's a pretty substantial request. Okay, so one more place over in 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. It says, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So that whole honor the king thing, yeah, if you're going to apply that back to the American Revolution, that is kind of your answer for you. Although specifically in the American Revolution, the colonists were subject to Parliament. So there was a deliberative body, an elected assembly to which they were subject. Parliament, the British Parliament. And there was a king. The monarchy parliament system is kind of working its way toward the modern construct. Queen Victoria will have a lot to do with that later. But basically, the monarch today has much less influence and much less power than the monarch did in the 18th century. But ultimately, the colonists are subject to Parliament. So what grounds could you use to support the revolution? Well, I've heard people say that the British really didn't want much to do with the American colonists, and so they just kind of let them go. That's great, except it's just not factually true. Parliament is still passing laws about the colonies up until the time that the colonies rebel. So they definitely care about them. They've put British soldiers over there. They have British governors over there. Everybody in England cares very much about what's going on in the American colonies. I've heard people say, well, the British soldiers didn't protect the American colonists. Well, that might be true in specific regions. There might be like local areas where they weren't protected, and that's because there just weren't that many British soldiers over here. You know, we kind of have this picture in our mind where everybody has a British soldier living in their living room. There were actually very few instances where British soldiers, if any, that I'm not aware of anyone specifically, I'm sure they're out there, where British soldiers came and took your house over. What they would do, the Quarter Act required the colonists to pay for housing for the British soldiers, or the British soldiers could use vacant or abandoned buildings in the cities. So if there was a vacant building, the soldiers could come and the soldiers could use that building. But I'm not aware of the soldiers having the right to come into your house and kick you out and live there. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what was going on in the 18th century. But I'm not aware of the fact that the British soldiers came over here and said, we're not going to protect these people. I'm not aware of the British soldiers coming over and kicking people out of their homes, although that was certainly how it was politicized here in the United States. So I don't know of a good reason other than the fact that you have some fairly suspicious characters. John Hancock, for example, is a smuggler. Yeah. He signs his name really big on the Declaration of Independence. But John Hancock is a smuggler. So he's not exactly a nice guy. And you have a lot of the other people who are fomenting rebellion, who are doing these things, who are very influential people, but they're not necessarily upstanding characters. And what has happened is when we look back, we kind of whitewash them, or we don't get into their personal lives. Like, I didn't know until a few years ago that John Hancock was a smuggler. He was a whiskey smuggler. He was a molasses smuggler. He smuggled all kinds of things. He's kind of like an American pirate, sort of. And so it's one of those things where when you're looking back, one side isn't wicked and terrible and the other side isn't totally good and nice. I just don't know of a substantial reason that would allow me as a Christian to say, okay, I can rebel against this government, because every passage that we've looked at, Romans 13, Jesus and Luke chapter 20, Titus chapter 3, 1 Peter 2, all of these passages are saying submit to the government, submit to the government. And so to come along and say, well, submit to the government always unless it's this British king or this British parliament, that doesn't make sense. Right? So we should be submissive to the government. And so now we come to our government today. Really, what happened in the 18th century doesn't have much to do with me today. But what does have to do with me today is, will I submit to my government? Will I do what my government says to do today? When they pass laws that I don't like, or when they say things that I disagree with, am I going to be willing to submit to that government? If they pass whatever legislation it is that you really care about, if they pass the opposite of what you want, will you submit to it? Yes or no? And it doesn't matter, and ultimately here's the thing, right? It doesn't matter your take on the law. It matters what the governing officials' take on the law is. And if a state passes laws, you can't say, well, the Constitution says, the state constitution says, this penal code says, so I'm not going to do what you say. That's not Christianity. That's not the principles that are put in place here. Right? It says, submit yourself to the Lord's sake for every institution, to a king as one of authority, or governor sent by him. So the idea here is that you're subject, not to a document, you are subject to the body of rulers. And so if the body of rulers where you live, those appointed as in charge over us, if the body of rulers decides to do something that a document says isn't right, now take that battle up in the courts. And usually when there's pending legislation, there's a stay put in place. But if there's no stay put in place, you obey the governing authorities. You obey those over you. That is just what it says. And so it's difficult as a Christian because we feel like we have these rights and we feel like there are things that cannot be infringed upon. And we feel like looking back in history that we want to justify the founding fathers. But I just don't know that we can do that. There is, however, a book that I can't remember the title of. There's a book that somebody suggested I read that kind of shows why the American Revolution was justified. I'll try and get the title of it. I'll post it in the comments, and I'll try and read it and see what I think about it. But ultimately, when you look at Luke chapter 20, Romans chapter 13, Titus chapter 3, 1 Peter chapter 2, those things pretty much say just do what the government says. Just do what the government says. So that's kind of where I stand on that. Would it have been right to rebel? No, I don't think I would have been in the cause of the rebellion. I don't think I would have been waving the Union Jack around either. I would have tried to live peaceably and quietly, like we see in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Now, what do you do after the rebellion? So the rebellion starts, and now you're in the middle of a war, and you don't know which government to be subject to. Man, I have no idea. Don't ask me about that. So it's kind of like the Civil War. If you lived in Virginia, one day you're part of the United States, and the next day there's this secession. What do you do? That's a much more difficult question. I don't know. I don't know what I would do. I would have to think really hard about it. Or today, what if this week Texas secedes from the United States? Well, I'm a U.S. citizen today, and the next day now I'm not. What do you do? Man, I don't know. Don't know. I'd have to work through that one. That would be difficult. Which government then would have power over you? But ultimately, Luke 20, Romans 13, Titus 3, 1 Peter chapter 2, be submissive to the government. Be submissive to the government. Thanks. If you got questions, put them in the comments. See y'all later.